I think controllers are pretty cool. I mean, I've already spoken at length about some of the physical designs of controllers, but really that only tells half the story. Because even though the DualSense might have all the buttons you'd expect a controller like this to have, it's up to the developers and the designers of the game you're playing to map the actions to the controller. You ever start playing a game and you're really enjoying it, but then you figure out that some seemingly simple action like, I don't know, jumping, is mapped to something just completely arbitrary, like sprinting and mashing the B button at the same time? Yeah, thank you, Dark Souls. Or you could have the exact opposite reaction and play a game where you pretty much already know where all the controls are mapped, and it just feels comfortable and familiar, and you already know what's going on, right? Well, that's the other half we're here to talk about today. Control schemes. Listen, I'm not going to be able to cover every game ever in this video, so I went ahead and picked out 3 specific games to talk about that all do something relatively interesting with their control schemes given the genre that they're in. And if you happen to know any other games with interesting control schemes, then go ahead and leave a comment down in the comments section. And while you're there, there's that, you know, pretty nice button down there that says subscribe. Hey, wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't you want to hit the subscribe button, right? All right, anyway, let's talk about Metroid Prime. Listen, I already know that everyone on the internet has already talked to death about Metroid Prime. And I know that everyone already has their own opinions on the control scheme. Some people love the controls, some people hate them, some people were kinda off-put by them in the remaster. But given the circumstances of like what first-person shooters were on console and, you know, the time period this game was developed in, I think Retro Studios did a really good job giving Samus a first-person shooter type control scheme. Because you gotta remember, Metroid Prime came out in 2002. Halo had only just released about a year earlier. So its control scheme, the one that a lot of people consider the gold standard of first-person shooter controls, wasn't exactly adopted as the standard yet. And like, Nintendo has always been known for kind of ignoring what the rest of the gaming industry does, for better or for worse. And there's also some really cool UI choices that were made to complement the control scheme. So alright, let's just start off with something simple, like movement. If you've played any first-person shooter, you would know that left stick controls movement and right stick controls camera. But in Metroid Prime, the left stick controls movement and turning, so it's kind of like tank controls. Meanwhile, the right stick, or in this case the C stick, controls what kind of beam you have equipped. Now you might be thinking like, what the fuck, like what kind of control scheme is that? I thought the right stick was supposed to control camera. Well, here, look, if you pay attention to the UI of the game, and then look down at the GameCube controller, you'll notice that the D-pad and the C-stick are kind of down at the bottom, just kind of pushed to the side almost. And if you look at the UI of the game, you'll see that beam selection is on the right side of the screen in the bottom, and then visor selection would be in the bottom left, where the D-pad would be. And this honestly just goes back to why I like Nintendo's UI and UX design, because they really put a focus on how the player actually interacts with the game. I've already mentioned the shape of the X and Y buttons and how everything is positioned, but in Metroid Prime specifically, it's really cool to see how the placement of buttons on the controller also affects the placement of UI elements on the screen. And after playing this game for like more than a couple of hours, it all just sort of makes sense. And like, the game was designed around this control scheme. You're not going to be expected to have Doomslayer levels of accuracy here. Because Metroid games aren't about the combat, they're about the exploration and the discovery of the world you're in and figuring out where you gotta go next. And then there's things like movement, which I feel like ended up the way they are just due to necessity. Because I'm sure that Retro had seen Halo's control scheme and had tried to playtest this game using a GameCube controller and realized that controlling a camera with the C-stick isn't the most fun thing to do. I mean, if you haven't held a GameCube controller in a while, let me tell you, the C-stick is not a very comfortable section to use. Also, here's a really fun fact. Turns out you can play the remaster with a GameCube controller, but the game doesn't know you're using a GameCube controller, and it thinks you're using just a normal Pro controller. So that means there just aren't enough buttons to do basic things like lock on, or change the control options, or open certain menus. It's kinda crazy that it even works in the first place, but yeah, like, would not recommend playing the remaster of Metroid Prime with a GameCube controller. Just use a normal controller, I guess. So with the left stick, you can really only move forward, backward, and turn left and right. So then that begs the question, well, what happens when you need to look up, or an enemy starts flying around you? Well, that's what the L button's for. The L button is your lock-on button. So as long as your crosshair is like vaguely in the direction of an enemy, if you hold down the L button, Samus will just lock onto the enemy and you can start firing away at it. But that lock-on can only go so far if you can't look up, so the right analog trigger is what plants Samus's feet and lets her look around using the left stick. Again, it's not exactly what we're used to, but given the circumstances of the times, I feel like this works. And now we can finally start talking about the face buttons, which, honestly, I think this is my favorite part of every single GameCube game. Okay, so let's envision playing Metroid Prime for a little bit. If you've never played it, that's totally fine. What do you think is the #1 action you're going to be doing throughout the entirety of your playthrough? If you said jump, you're close, but the right answer is shooting. You're going to be shooting a lot more than you're going to be jumping, so it makes sense for the A button to be shoot. And given that the jumping control is important, but not as important as shooting, you relegate the jump button to the B button. It's always right in reach and exactly where you need it to be. And then we have Y for firing missiles and X for switching into Morph Ball mode. And honestly, I don't really got much to say about this specific mapping. It feels like they could both work even if they're swapped. I don't know, it's just how the game ended up being. But like I said, I think given the circumstances of when and where this game was developed, I feel like Retro did a great job with its control scheme. But, you know, all of these words don't really matter, considering you can just change the control scheme in the remaster, and that one is more readily available than the original, and okay, you know what? Anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about God Hand. So God Hand is a very, very interesting game. I like to think of it as the death grips of character action games. The further you go down the rabbit hole, everyone ends up looking at God Hand one way or another. You play games like Devil May Cry, or Bayonetta, or Vanquish, any other platinum-based game, and you start thinking to yourself like, wow, what other games did these people make? And so then you learn about Clover Studios, a subsidiary of Capcom that's responsible for games like Okami, and Beautiful Joe, and this bastard. Okay, enough beating around the bush. Why is this game so fucked up and weird? Well, much like Metroid Prime, God Hand has tank controls. Listen, I promise that this was coincidental, alright? Also, please excuse my lack of an authentic PS2 controller. Believe it or not, this was actually the controller that I beat God Hand with. Alright, so in God Hand, you use the left stick to move, forward, backward, turn left, turn right, and the right stick, instead of picking moves, or switching beams, or opening the map, or any other action, the right stick is mapped to dodging. Flick the stick backwards, you do a backflip, left and right gets you a left and right dodge, and flicking the stick up makes you juke your head back and forth to dodge high punches. And the coolest part is that every single dodge has its own unique place in combos and has its own purpose for dodging specific moves. Remember, Jean only has punches and kicks, so if you've backflipped out of the way to dodge a punch, you're also not in range to throw any punches of your own. So if some asshole's trying to throw a punch at you, that's when you juke and dodge, and you're right in position to just give him a counterattack. And then there are moves that really you should only be getting out of the way of. Like when Elvis decides to jump up and slam his ass down on the ground. Oh, by the way, this guy's name is Elvis. He's Hispanic, like aggressively Hispanic.
Yeah! I don't think you realize what you're getting yourself into, pendejo!
And I love everything about him. And then you get to movement with the left stick, and you might be thinking that, well, tank controls maybe isn't the best choice for this character action game, but the camera's always so close to you, and you're always looking directly forward at whatever enemy you're facing. It makes it really easy to keep track of whatever the enemy is doing, and also whatever you're doing. It's honestly like a single-player fighting game. And then we haven't even gotten into like building custom like attack strings. You go into this casino area and you can buy a jab or a hook or a rapid punch or a drunken punch. And then you put those punches or kicks in any order you want. And some punches are good for starters, some punches are good for enders. Some are good in the middle, but you're not gonna know what's good where until you start experimenting. And that's square, that's your main combo button, but other buttons that you have can also be remapped to certain moves. So you always have access to certain sweeps or kicks that may or may not be useful depending on the situation. And bro, like, there's so much more to it. We've been talking for this long about just the face buttons and the right analog stick. We haven't even began to talk about the triggers and the bumpers yet. Now, R1, that opens up the roulette wheel. On there, you have access to a bunch of super moves, basically. And then, of course, you can also go to the shop, buy new roulette moves, and change the order they appear on the roulette wheel. But those cost meters, so you're not going to be doing those moves all the time, and as such, they're pretty fucking strong. R2 is for going into basically Super Saiyan mode. You're invincible, all of your attacks instantly cancel into each other, you always stun enemies, you always get the correct combo, but that's not gonna last forever, so be mindful of when and where you use it. And the L1 button is a 180-degree turn. So if some asshole's trying to gank you from behind, you can immediately turn around and have the advantage. I personally ended up using this button a ton while I played God Hand. It's so fucking useful. About as useful as it is in Resident Evil 4, actually. And then L2. L2 is the taunt button. Now you might be thinking, why is there a taunt button in this single-player character action game? Well, it actually does play into the mechanics of the game and its dynamic difficulty. You see that little skull down there? Well, that meter is actually your difficulty level. There are 4 difficulty levels: level 1, 2, 3, and die. The meter goes up the better you are at the game, and goes down the worse you are at the game. So doing combos, killing enemies, and just being cool will make the difficulty go up. And then also getting hit, dying, groveling, those make the difficulty go down. So taunting enemies will actually make them angry and make them more prone to mistakes, make them attack stronger, and make them attack faster. So if you know what you're doing and you know how enemies are going to react to you taunting them, buddy, you can really take advantage of that. But why would you want to taunt enemies? Well, taunting enemies will actually give you more of the meter that lets you activate the God Hand mode. So if you taunt and make the enemies more aggressive, you're getting rewarded by being able to go into Super Saiyan mode more often. But you gotta be careful when you're doing it, because if you taunt them too much, you might get your shit rocked. Every single aspect of God Hand's controls and combat are perfectly tuned with each other. Everything has a use, everything has a purpose, and if you don't use every single piece of your toolkit, you're gonna have some troubles. Yeah, it's gonna take a while to get used to, but once you get used to the controls, and once you finally understand what God Hand really is, oh man, it's one of the best combat systems in video games, period. I would argue to say that it's the best combat system. And it is a crying shame that Clover Studios went bankrupt and Capcom just never wants to bring this game back, so yar har, me hearties, go get yourself a copy of God Hand. I'll shut up about that when Capcom finally brings God Hand to Steam, but until then, you know what, let's just drop this and talk about Boomerang X instead. Now, Boomerang X is an insanely fun arena shooter that you might not think belongs in this video, because I mean, you can just play this game with a mouse and keyboard. What's strange about a mouse and keyboard controls? But what I think is really interesting about Boomerang X is it comes with a new and relatively unheard of control scheme called Flick Stick. So I haven't talked about it much. I actually have a video in the works right now talking about it, but I think gyro aim is the way of the future. I think every controller should have gyro built in, and I also think it's a crying shame that companies like Microsoft are just sort of dragging their feet on it. Hell, even PlayStation be dragging their feet, but thankfully things like the DualSense and the DualShock 4 have gyro built in. Ironically enough, it's actually been Nintendo that's been paving the way for gyro aim, but we'll get more in depth on that in another video. So let's skip ahead and assume you're already using gyro aim on your controller. Well, if you're doing that, then the right analog stick doesn't need to function in the exact same way it has been. There's actually a little bit of room to change how it controls. So with it enabled, you're going to be doing a lot of your precision aiming with the gyro, but let's say you wanted to look 90 degrees to the right. In order to look 90 degrees to the right, you would need to flick the right stick to the right. And then if you want to look 90 degrees to the left again, you'd hit the control stick to the left. And it's all relative, so the way that you turn is going to be relative to how your character was already facing. Flicking the stick up will just make you face forward. Flicking it a little bit to the right and up, that'll make you turn a little bit to the right. Flicking it down will make you turn 180 degrees. I think you can kind of understand what I'm getting at here. And on paper, this control scheme seems really cool. It allows you to take advantage of gyro aim while also having really fast and fluid movements with actually turning your character. I personally believe that this is the closest you can get to the levels of accuracy you can achieve on a mouse. But here's the thing. Flickstick has a very steep learning curve. When I first started playing Boomerang X with this control scheme, man, I struggled, let me tell you. And to be honest with you, I'm still kind of struggling with it. I've definitely gotten better, but I'm not gonna say I'm an expert. This is a new control scheme that completely recontextualizes what we all consider to be a standard for controllers. It is a genuine innovation, and I really hope more games adopt this. And when I say new, I mean like this shit was developed in 2018. I'll actually have a link to the original creator's YouTube channel down in the description so you can see just like exactly how he envisions this control scheme being used. Matter of fact, Steam actually has presets for using this control scheme in any game using Steam input. And in theory, you could play any first-person or third-person shooter with Flickstick. But that's only in theory because another downside to this is setting it up. It takes a lot of work of finely tuning different sliders and tabs in Steam input, going back into the game and like, oh man, like it kind of just, it almost feels right, and then you adjust the slider a little bit more and it's like, oh, now it feels even worse, so you adjust it back and it's like, okay, we're getting closer to what I'm thinking about, and then you adjust it again and you go back into the game and it's like, okay, now it feels like fine. It's a lot of fiddling with menus and fiddling with options that, like, honestly, a lot of people just aren't gonna deal with. And so that's why I think Boomerang X is notable in this instance, because it comes with it built in. And it's also just a really fun arena shooter, and I would highly recommend it. Like, I'll have a link to this game in the description too. I guess my hope for the future is that I just want Flickstick to become more common, and I also want capacitive control stick tops to be the standard. Like, oh man, just being able to activate and deactivate the gyro feature just by placing your finger on the joystick, oh man, it's so nice. It's so nice. But anyway, I think that's enough of my pipe dreams for one video. Special shout outs to my buddy Aaron, who supplied this wonderfully terrible PowerPoint powered animation, I guess, of Bizmo. It looks horrendous. We made it even worse. There's like 9 jokes hidden within this footage. See if you can find them all. I also want to give a shout out to the YouTube lads over here who supply me with the funds necessary to make this channel happen. They also get a bunch of special perks like behind the scenes videos and special members exclusive posts and all kinds of stuff. So what are you doing? Just go ahead and hit that button that's right down there. It's not free, but the subscribe button is free. Yeah, subscribing. Man, I'm just getting all the shilling done right now. So yeah, thanks to everybody, especially you, for watching this far into the video. Ha 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 ha. Anyway, that's enough rambling from me. This video took a lot out of me, but I feel like it was worth it in the end. So yeah. Okay. Anyway.